and thank you for downloading this episode of Witness History from the BBC World Service with me, Rachel Naylor. Today, I'm taking you back more than 30 years to the opening of one of the world's most remote museums on a British island in the South Atlantic. It remains open today and gets 15,000 visitors a year. It's 1954, and 5-year-old Jan Cheek and her family are moving to South Georgia, an island on the icy southern edge of the Atlantic Ocean, just above the Antarctic Circle. It's one of the world's largest whaling centres, but to say it's remote is an understatement. It's one of the most isolated places on Earth. It was a 3.5-day boat ride from the Falkland Islands on a tiny steamer with scientists and sheep.
The sea journey was horrendous. Seas are very rough. We were in a very small cabin, and apart from my mother, who was an amazing sailor, the rest of us were dreadfully seasick all the way. Once we got there, it was exciting. Again, one of our first impressions was of a young elephant seal falling out of the tussock as we walked up the path. Tussock is a very long, strong grass, which gave us something of a fright, and then we were kept awake that night by the adults sort of grunting outside our bedroom window. Even to a child's eyes, I could see how beautiful it was, the clear water. But then when we looked across at the whaling station, it was very industrial. And on days when they were flensing, that is cutting up whales on the wooden platform that they did that work on, the sea would be brick red with whale blood for about a quarter of a mile out from the station. So an amazing contrast to the sort of snow-capped mountains and glaciers all around us.
But the whaling industry's days were numbered, and by 1965, the last station on South Georgia had closed down. Nearly 30 years later, in 1991, Jan's friend, zoologist Nigel Bonner, was involved in the clean-up operation. Large stores of diesel were leaking and contaminating the soil and attracting elephant seals.
During that time, he decided that there was a danger of a lot of history being lost, because unfortunately, in the time since the whaling stations had been abandoned, a lot of looting and vandalism had taken place, a free-for-all. So there was a danger that a great many artefacts would be lost, and he thought it would be great to gather them all up.
Nigel started to store all the artefacts in the derelict station manager's villa in Grytviken, and he then had a brainwave. There was enough to create a museum, and in 1992, the South Georgia Whaling Museum was opened to visitors. And surprisingly, given its location, more than 2,000 kilometres from Argentina, Nigel wasn't worried about business.
Well, at that time, there were a few pioneering expedition cruise vessels going to South Georgia, so it became a particular attraction for them.
3 years later, in 1995, Jan was asked to be a trustee. Jan's family had moved to South Georgia when her dad got offered a job there as the island's policeman.
Because the whaling stations were meant to be dry, that is, no alcohol, because it was such a dangerous industry, he used to have to search visiting ships and make sure they didn't have any contraband, and if he found it, he had to break the bottles on the side of the ship and throw them overboard. He said he felt like the most unpopular man on the island when he was doing that. Occasionally, people used to have illicit stills and brew their own alcohol, and sometimes someone would become dangerously out of control on probably near poisonous alcohol, and he would have to go and restrain them and maybe lock them up for a night.
So was there somewhere to lock them up?
Yes, there was a little jail next door to us, and when there was a prisoner, my mother used to cook and take a meal around to them.
In the 1950s, Jan and her 2 siblings were the only children on the island.
It was fun. We had no formal school. Our mother used to just let us run free most of the time, which we greatly appreciated, enjoyed, and quickly learned to set our own boundaries. We'd go so far up a mountain, and if rocks started falling, we'd come back down again. My mother, who was a very stoical character, managed to keep us fed and clothed in spite of there not being a shop within 800 miles.
And what if anyone ever needed medical attention?
There were doctors on the island. Fortunately, we rarely needed their services, although my younger brother did break a leg when he built himself a ski jump. But luckily there was a good doctor in post at the time.
Given South Georgia's proximity to the Antarctic, it has a polar climate, with highs of -2 degrees Celsius in summer and lows of -15 in winter, complete with winds strong enough to tip over helicopters.
We used to see icebergs, quite a lot of glaciers. In winter, we would get a lot of snow. So to get around, you either had skis, otherwise you needed snowshoes, because drifts around the house would sometimes be 8 foot deep. So quite a cool climate, but on sunny days when it was calm and beautiful, we used to be out in our shorts and sandals, and used to be very amused when the Falkland Islands Dependencies Survey arrived trying out all their Antarctic kit and saw these children playing in T-shirts and shorts. They would slink back to their cabins and get rid of the parkas and things.
Residents on the island mainly ate tinned and dried food, but they could get certain fresh fruits and vegetables, like cabbages, potatoes and apples, from the whaling stations, where they'd have cold stores. And of course, there was plenty of whale meat.
It wasn't the meat of choice, but what would happen, a very large cube would be hung on a meat hook outdoors, and a lot of the oil would go to the outside, forming a sort of black coating, which would then be cut off. And then it used to be sort of casseroled, and it was rather coarse-grained.
Sounds delicious. Although the museum started out with a focus on whaling, it now features exhibitions on all aspects of island life, including living conditions, natural history, and the Irish explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, whose grave is on the island. There are even photos of Jan's family.
It's rather nice because it shows what hardy little children we were. We're actually standing in Gull Lake with our feet in icy water and wearing summer dresses and seeming quite unbothered by it. So yes, it's amusing to see.
Today, there are no permanent residents on South Georgia, just 20 or so workers, from scientists to maintenance staff. The founder of the museum, Nigel Bonner, died in 1994. It's now run by the South Georgia Heritage Trust, which is based in Scotland, and it's free to visit. If you fancy going, you should know the island is only accessible by sea, and it takes at least 5 days from South America. There's no visitor accommodation ashore either, so best to go by cruise ship or yacht. And be careful, because there's no medical facilities or emergency services. But Jan, who now lives in the Falklands, still thinks it's worth a visit. And so does Sir David Attenborough, who narrates a visitor's guide to South Georgia on the government's website.
I first came here to film for the BBC in 1981, and I've returned again and again. Landing on South Georgia is always exciting, as I know well. Doing so for the first time can be almost surreal. It's impossible not to appreciate the beauty and wonder. So do take the time to just watch, and you will see unforgettable things.
Jan Cheek was speaking to me, Rachel Naylor, for that episode of the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service. If you enjoy our podcast, why not leave us a review?